For it so falls out that what we have we prize not the worth, whilst we enjoy it. But being lacked and lost, why then we rack the value, then we find the virtue that possession would not show us whilst it was ours. This quote from William Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing is a quote that sums up a simple truth. We take for granted the things we have, and only when we lose those things do we start to fully appreciate how much those things meant to us while we had them. In other words, you don't know what you have until you've lost it. Jake Park is the living embodiment of this truth, a young man with everything, who put it aside, and only in his darkest moment did he start to understand what he'd just thrown away. But far too late for him to change his fate. Welcome back to the realm of the entity, the land of fear, death, and carnage. A place where the most horrible fiends and killers roam with a ravenous bloodthirst, and a weary band of survivors struggle in vain to fend off the killers and retain their sanity. Today we're going to talk about Jake Park, a young man with a very fine start in life who didn't realize what he had until he discarded it. Jake Park was born to a very wealthy and affluent family in South Korea. Under constant pressure to live up to the expectations of his family name that was put on him by society, Jake caved under the weight of it all. Not really an academically gifted young man, Jake's father spent a fortune giving Jake the best education he could possibly have, but it never set well with Jake, and as his grades seemed to deteriorate constantly, his faith and love for his father wavered too. Jake despised his English teachers who criticized his inability to understand the things he read or messed up words or phrases. But he was just creative, wanting to express new ideas and perspectives he was seeing on the page. They didn't understand what he was seeing in the text, but then again, his own father didn't seem to understand Jake either. Jake never felt like his father cared for him the way he should. He dismissed his struggles as mere immaturity, and after some digging in the family attic, Jake came across a letter from his grandfather. He inquired about it to his father, who dismissed it almost outright, showing a sudden contempt that Jake had never seen before. It turns out that during the Korean War, Jake's grandfather had taken it upon himself to help refugees and civilians escape the cataclysms of war and find safety, and had indeed gone missing and presumed dead in the wake of all the confusion and insanity. Jake came to idolize his grandfather, a man who didn't rely on money or Fortune 500 companies. A real hero. He roughed it in the great outdoors and survived on his own wits and made the world a better place for many people. And what had his father done? Reaped the benefits of his fortune, lived a lavish life, and neglected his own son, who he refused to understand or get to know. It was clear who Jake truly took after. And things finally came to a head after an argument between Jake and his father, where Jake had inferred his father was weak, whereas his grandfather had been strong. He ran away from home and made his way to the forest where his grandfather had lived. He talked to many people on his way there who had known his grandfather or were related to people who knew his grandfather. They told him of the man's bravery, his insistence on helping others, but they warned him he's not the kind of man you want to live like. Jake ignored them. He wandered deep into the forest, leaving behind everything from his old life, and his poor mother tried desperately to check in on him, to convince him to come home. But he wouldn't. He refused to leave the isolation of the forest. But as weeks passed, the ordeal of isolation and forest living began to become difficult. He was always hungry, always unsure, and soon he began hearing voices in his head. The voice of his grandfather at first, then his father, and then he couldn't tell the difference between them. He tried to learn how to meditate, to push back the pain and to focus on the tasks at hand, to try to forget his hunger and his agony. But it was becoming harder with each passing day, and at one point he found himself writing a letter to his father, telling him how he truly felt. But as he sat on it, he just couldn't finish it. He never wanted to finalize the piece. Why? His father might not even read it. And even if he did send it to his father, what would it change? Would his father somehow have a revelation and suddenly care about his son again? Or, even if he did, would Jake be able to accept him? Every time he tried to write the letter, he would simply remember the anger his father held towards him, and he'd put the letter away again. One day, driven by hunger and delirium, he was stalking a wild boar intent on eating it, but lost focus in the heat of the hunt, nearly dying in his own pitfall trap. As the boar lay dying, he thought the pig began to speak to him, telling him that he was no better than his father or grandfather. Neither of them could learn to let go of resentment, contempt, duty. While Jake staunchly affirmed that he had made no error, that he had done what was necessary, he confessed he didn't really know who he was meant to be or where he was supposed to go. He was hurting, and he was lost. But not just lost in the woods, but lost in direction. He couldn't live up to the pressures of his father's name, but he also couldn't live in total isolation like this much longer. He wasn't his father, and he wasn't his grandfather. What was he to do? That night, while trying to carve up his kill, a pack of wolves rushed from the forest to take his food. Climbing up a tree, he tried to hold the pig carcass out of reach. A single wolf leapt up and grabbed the pig. Jake furiously tried to fight the wolf off, desperately clinging to his food like a feral animal. But the more he struggled, the more he began to realize the truth, the reality. This entire time, all these days in the woods and all those angry, tear-filled nights by a dim campfire, he had never realized that the wolves were always upon him, always clinging to him and the things he possessed. The wolves that were his pains and his pressures. He had not fled from his father to a life he wanted, but rather a life of escapism. And fleeing from his problem was not going to solve them. It would only create more wolves to cling to him and fight for what little he had left. He finally had to do what his mother urged him to do, what his hallucinations begged him to do. He let go. And as the wolves ran away into the night with his kill, Jake pulled the letter from his pocket that he had planned to send his father and walked back to his fire to finish it so he could finally let it all go. But Jake's letter never reached his father. In fact, Jake was never heard from again. Despite his mother's pleas to find him, the authorities couldn't waste any more resources on a boy most likely eaten by wolves or simply died to hunger in the woods. Just another casualty of the forest. Or so they believed. Only one knows the true fate of Jake Park, and the entity is not one to divulge his secrets. Jake's story is one that unfortunately resonates with me in a pretty big way. As many of you know, I do struggle with depression. My father used to say that depression was just someone letting sadness rule their thoughts, and that's definitely part of it, but it's how depression comes out that really sucks. Depression isn't caused by sadness, it's often caused by pressure. You work so hard and so long to make a difference, to figure out what you're meant to do and who you're meant to be, constantly pushed and pulled by the expectations of those around you. And as you struggle to please everyone, the moments of validation are fleeting, while the moments of criticism abound. You feel stretched, weak, and tired. Over time, even the act of being happy becomes its own trial. And I know that agony. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, though I know I'm not alone in that. For Jake, it's far worse than what I deal with. I've said before that we should never assume the state of someone based only on their financial or social status. The privilege of the wealthy is also the burden of social expectation and covetous inclinations. When you have, the ones who do not have will hate you for it. And Jake, as a boy, had a great deal. And people looked on him with that very idea. You have everything. Therefore, you'd better live up to that expectation of wealth. But Jake wanted something more than money and education. He wanted his father to just understand him. But his father, a man who'd grown up under a father who neglected him to pursue his own ideals of righteous heroism, looked down on the idea of impoverishment. He looked down on the ideas of what Jake was pushing. He wanted what he thought was best for Jake. He wanted to give Jake all the things his father never gave him. But the one thing Jake needed was a father who gave himself to his son. When Jake couldn't take the pressure of his livelihood, he fell upon the romanticism of his grandfather, which infuriated his father. Think about it. Quite often when we feel detached from something, or we want to detach ourselves from something, we rush to something that we can romanticize. Jake's grandfather was a hero to many people. He roughed it in the great outdoors, and through that managed to save a lot of refugees and help get them out of trouble. But he never stopped to consider how his father might feel. His father, who didn't have a father himself around because his father was off gallivanting in the woods, doing what he thought was right, but never had the love of his father or the presence of his father. So he had to work himself up to get everything he had by his own good works and by tying up his own bootlaces. And now that he has the opportunity to give his son everything he didn't have, he's going to give it to him. And when Jake complains, "I don't like this," well, you don't understand what I had. It is this rift, this greater rift, that caused Jake to run away and his father to not understand what was missing. Jake ran from the pressure he thought his father was placing on him, but in reality, it wasn't his father, it was himself. Depression makes you your own worst enemy. Isolation becomes your solace, but the quiet of solitude crushes you gradually. The emptiness that once felt so inviting turns to madness. More than that, though, if I had to guess, I think Jake likely suffers from ADD, attention deficit disorder. I know, I have it too. That's why he struggled to focus in schools and why he was such a creative boy who couldn't quite concentrate and regurgitate information like his teachers wanted. I was similar to that. I would look at the pages of books while discovering whole new worlds within them without really caring about the literary devices I was supposed to be memorizing. I too felt pressure from my family, but luckily for me, my parents were far more quick to learn about what I needed and work with me to overcome those obstacles. I was fortunate. I think Jake's father was too caught up in his own senses of what to do, he couldn't see that his son really needed him around. Meanwhile, Jake, filled with the bitterness at a world he refused to compromise with, fell into the romanticism of his grandfather's exploits, running away to relive those same idealistic exploits himself. Jake is a creative young man, and quite often creativity leads one to the romantic. But all of it, from his unwillingness to compromise with his family and his desire to run away, is simply him evading the issue. But now, it's too late. I sympathize with Jake. Hell, I empathize with him. There were times growing up that I was him. I can't count the number of times I've wanted to run away into my favorite fantasies, becoming the heroic knight riding off to fight the monsters and die in glorious combat. Living a life I thought would be more meaningful than one trapped in a classroom, listening to math problems and lectures that I would never understand, nor did I want to understand. But my escape was in writing stories. If I couldn't live my dreams, I would bring them to life on paper. That became my answer. And I feel like I made the better option. At the very least, I'm not trapped in the realm of killers at any rate. Now, off of the lore stuff, Jake comes to DBD with 3 unique perks, all designed to help him survive longer and endure: Iron Will, Calm Spirit, and Saboteur. Killers can often hear injured survivors because of their grunts and moans of pain, but with Iron Will active, you can lower your grunts of pain up to 100%, making you far harder to hear. This is a great perk for a player who manages to slip away from sight and needs time to heal, but the killer is really close by. If you're lucky, they'll walk right past you without hearing you. Now, throughout the trial, there are crows and ravens who watch the trial, and if a killer or survivor gets close, they cry out and fly away. In fact, some killers carry a perk that allows them to get a notification if a crow is disturbed, telling them where a survivor is located. With Calm Will, Jake can walk by the crows without them panicking. But those are just mere bonuses compared to the power of Saboteur. Many a toxic survivors equip this perk just to be absolute shitters to the killer. When a survivor is picked up by the killer, Saboteur allows Jake to see the aura of all hooks within 56 meters of the killer, so he knows which ones he could potentially hook the survivor to. It also gives Jake the ability to disable a hook temporarily without a toolbox, which is a cooldown of up to 60 seconds. Now understand something. Carrying a toolbox gives any survivor the power to disable hooks, but Jake can do it without one. This means that there are plenty of Jakes who make it their goal to find the killer after he picks up a survivor, figure out where he's going, and then disable the hook he's heading to just to make that killer's life hell. Now imagine if all survivors run this perk or carry toolboxes. They could potentially disable 3 hooks near the killer to ensure the killer never hooks the survivor he's carrying. It is insane. But what I do like about these perks is how they tie into what Jake was and what he went through. His willingness to endure pain and push through it, his ability to meld with his environment and hide from those who seek to destroy him, and his desire to seize an advantage and deny his enemy their chance for victory. He's cunning, and he's a survivor. His time in isolation taught him these tools to endure and to survive. Though he may never get the closure he wanted with his family, he's finally learned to let go of who he was and the burdens he carried. I mean, after all, what good are those weight on your shoulders when you're running for your life? Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time in the fog.